This is a Rogue Media Network podcast.
Ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos and Waco. I'm safe when I reach San Antonio. He glanced back over his shoulder.
Well, welcome back to the Waco History Podcast. We are glad to have you here. Rick Tullis, frequent co-host, is back with me.
Thank you for having me back.
Well, it's
I
good
was
to have
getting
you
really
back.
bored. I needed something to do.
We trapped Rick in the archives to grow in his expertise on a topic, and he's come back with a really important one and the guest in town to talk about this. And so, Rick, I'll let you introduce what we're talking about and our guest.
Right. So before I mention the guest, I'm going to give you a quiz. This will help set us up. So, how many banks currently in Waco do you think there are? How many actual independent institutions do you think we have in Waco?
This is independent local banks or national banks?
Banks in general. Anything that calls itself a bank.
9.
You are way off.
Okay.
There are 21 banks
21
that I
banks.
found. I mean, there
Okay.
could be more, with over 56 locations.
Wow.
That's in Waco, and we're not talking about the suburbs or outside of Waco. And then throw into that another 10 or so credit unions. So
That just proves I'm not good on present information.
no,
I can only do historically.
no.
Yeah.
And if you were
Historically,
if you were bankable, someone would be banking you right
Historically, there was 9 banks. At some point, there was 9 banks.
now. There
Yeah.
may be.
Yeah.
But to enlighten us a little bit on the history of banking and financial institutions in Waco, we've invited David Lacy to join us today. David's family, he and his family have a long history here. David, welcome.
Thank you.
And if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about yourself before we dive into banking.
Well, banking on a podcast, this is the first podcast I've ever done, so I hope I know a little bit more about banking than I do podcast. But I will say that I have got a little history in that regard, not only myself, but my family before me. I am the 4th generation of bank presidents in Waco, Texas. My great-grandfather was W.D. Lacy, my namesake, William David Lacy, and he was a bank president at Citizens National Bank about 1900 or so to 1917.
So 1909 to 1917.
1909 to 1917. He passed away in 1917. And then my grandfather was Walter Lacy Sr., and he was bank president in Waco, I want to say mid-20s. Does that sound about right?
Well, what I had was 46 to 71.
No, that would be my father.
That's your father. Okay.
My grandfather, I think, was a mid-20s.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. 1919 to 1946.
Yeah, 1946. That sounds right. He was ready to retire when the war was over. In fact, served a little bit longer as president than he really had planned on serving.
Yeah, that's a long term.
But then my father, after that, was 1946 as president until about early 70s. And he served as president of Citizens National Bank as well. So the 3 of them were at Citizens National. And then I have been president of Community Bank and Trust here in Waco from 99, basically just about mid-year 99 until today.
All right.
And so our family's been involved in the banking scene in Waco, Texas for a long time, since basically 1884 when Citizens Bank was founded.
And I'll also say David is a member of the Texas Bankers Hall of Fame. So he is not. So his role here in town and also in the state is really important.
Right. And I think it's important. I mean, we'll get back in David in a minute. Since this podcast, if our listeners aren't aware, our host, Stephen Sloan, is the professor of the year at Baylor. So this is a star-studded room I'm in. I'm a nobody amongst 2 greats. So I'm really excited. All right, David, keep going.
Well, I think the topic of the day is basically the history of banking in Waco. And although there really aren't a whole lot of specific dates that I am familiar with, we do have kind of eras in time that I think are significant, and they add to the proliferation of banks as well as the reduction in banks. We had our city was rocking along, and I guess mid 1800s or so, and then this thing called the Civil War broke out. And when it was over, there was lots of change. And during that period of change, the number of banks in the city grew. Not only did it grow, but it was really a little bit better documented than it was prior to then.
Well, and I found one reference that said really prior to the Civil War and during the Civil War, there weren't any formal banks going on in Waco. So Waco founded in 1850. We're about to have the 125-year anniversary, but
15 years later, here we go.
Yeah,
I think that's about right. And I want to say that the number of banks got up to 10 or 12, but and they included names like Waco National Bank, which later changed its name to First National Bank, Citizens National Bank, but back then there were also the American National Bank, the Provident National Bank, the Farmers and Merchants National Bank, and National City Bank, and to name a few. And I think there were others. Liberty Bank, I think, is one that comes to mind. And anyway, with all that being said, right after the Civil War, it ended, and Waco built a bridge, and Waco ramped up its activity on the Chisholm Trail. And I think the combination, maybe not one or the other, but the combination of those two really led to some explosive growth in our city, and also some business. Might have been agricultural at the time with cotton and things of that sort. But the bottom line is our city was growing from about 1865 to, 1890 or 1900. It had a little growth spurt, and we were growing. We were not too terribly far from the population of Dallas at that time.
So here's a couple of neat references. Stephen and I often pull information out of the 1876 Waco and McLennan County Handbook, and it's kind of like a business directory in some ways, but it's got a couple blurbs on two of those banks in 1876. I think, like you said, coming out of the Civil War, a couple banks, and then it kind of took off. But it's interesting to hear in their voice what they thought of these banks. So let me quote this. This is about Waco National Bank. The present banking house of Fort and Jackson was established September 1st, 1869. First time I thought Fort and Jackson was a crossroads. Those are the actual people, Mr. Fort and Mr. Jackson. It was succeeded by Waco National Bank, which was incorporated under the National Bank Act in September 1874 and began business October 1st of that year. Its authorized capital was $150,000.
Man.
Its paid-up capital was $100,000. The stockholders of this bank are principal businessmen of Waco. The directory is composed of men with well-established reputation and are ablest financiers. Under the management of Colonel W.A. Fort, its president, and Mr. George Jackson, cashier, assisted by the courteous and competent officers who aid them in the administration of the affairs of this institution, has become deservedly popular and is doing an extensive and safe business. At the time we write this, December 1875, it holds of deposits of this community $175,000. And during the year ending October 1st, 1875, it paid 2 semi-annual dividends amounting to 12% and had a handsome sum left to credit for its reserve. Interesting. Okay, I read that. I got a couple questions for you, David. Seems like cashier was a little different position then than it is now.
It is. It was an important position, and it derived its name exactly as it sounds. That person had the responsibility in the bank of identifying and reconciling and handling the cash that was in the bank. And, of course, those transactions were predominant back in those days, and so that was a very, very important job.
Yeah. Okay, so here's the competitor, State Central Bank. A little blurb on them. The corporators of this institution are Mr. Peter McClelland, C.F. Gilbert, V.F. Hogan, and David S. Wood. They are all men of ample means, superior business qualifications, and unexceptionable reputations. They consulted the needs and the growing interests of Waco and the county when they established this bank, and the immense business it is now doing is the best evidence of the favor it has been met with. The capacious building recently erected for it is an honor and an ornament to Waco. The vault is as secure almost as human ingenuity can devise, and the arrangements and fixtures are specially designed for convenience and beauty. Exchange can be had there on all the principal cities of this country and in Europe, while depositors can demand no higher protection against loss than the careful manner which characterizes the administration of the affairs of this bank.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, you think about the structure of banks then, where you have these primarily private now you think about the federal government's role in banking and lending and all of that. And of course, here we just have private investors that are putting their money in the bank. But I'm wondering how many people are actually engaged in banking. Regular people are engaged in banking at this time.
In that day,
yeah.
Well, more than you might think. As shareholders, it was very common to have 100 or 200 shareholders, and they might not own a huge block of stock, but a lot of them, I mean, they literally, I can speak to Community Bank. We literally knocked on doors up and down Washington Avenue back in 1951 to say, would you like to buy some stock in the bank? We're going to build next year. $15 a share was the price at that point in time, and it got to be fully subscribed. So by just common people. So I want to say maybe more than you think, but in the forms of shareholders rather than officers or directors.
Yeah, so if we think about the function of a bank at this time and this number of banks we're talking about, what's directly related to that is the amount of credit that's available.
Yeah, and the larger your capital account, the more loans you can make. And that has kind of always been the case, and hope will always be the case. But when you listen to some of those names, it's the first thing that comes to my mind is the city fathers, whoever they were at that point in time, named a lot of streets in this city for those folks.
Yeah.
And so you need to they played vital roles, and
right.
I wish I knew more about them, but have a lot of respect for them.
One thing that comes out to me when I read those passages, there's a lot of emphasis on the safety of the banks, and of course this was the edge of the West, right? So we although Waco was somewhat sophisticated, probably had about 4,000 or 5,000 people in it at that time. The county probably had twice that much, so a lot of the customers were farmers and ag-related out in the county. But safety was important. I couldn't really find anything on robberies that happened in Waco. I'm sure there are, but I do remember a reference when we talked about Sam Bass a few episodes back, a well-known train robber of the day who got the Rangers caught up with him in Round Rock just down the road, but in his story, he and his gang came through Waco, and they were going to rob a bank, and one of the guys in the gang who survived said, well, we decided to pass because the banks were so well guarded in Waco, so they just kept on moving. So
that's a fun story to listen to.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah.
One thing that I brought to at least throw out for discussion is a quote that I heard a long time ago. I'm not real sure who to attribute it to, But the bottom line is, when I see quotes specifically about banking, I kind of make a mental note and look at it. This particular one says, the commercial bank is the lifeblood of the community of which it is a part. Neither one, the bank nor the community, can grow or prosper without the other. They necessarily grow together. I know that my dad appreciated that quote because he's the one who pointed it out to me. And as I have grown through the years, I really appreciate that as well. A good banker is involved in the community and helps the community grow economically. And that's probably the best thing you can do to grow your bank. And so, we had these massive little periods of time. We built a bridge and the Civil War ended and the Chisholm Trail kind of came to Waco not terribly long after the Civil War. We had cotton and cattle, but then, it wasn't all that long later in the late 20s and early 30s, we had this thing called a depression. And so that quote becomes meaningful both in the good times, but also in the bad times. And banking has seen some rough times. And so that is a component part of this story. It just is. And so the fact that we had 10 or 12 banks, I don't know, maybe even one or two more than that in the 1890s, 1900, the Depression constricted that a good bit.
Yeah.
And that was right after some of the best times in Waco. Cotton was king.
Yeah.
I mean, Waco was really a financial hub in the state because of the value of cotton. That later went away with the crash of cotton and oil. The oil wealth that was generated in the early part of the century kind of took away from what Waco was doing. But the echoes of that wealth creation, I think reverberates in banks and other financial institutions, insurance, and other things that have carried on, and families that have carried on in the community.
Absolutely. Of course, the Depression, and then Waco, unlike some other cities in the early 50s, had a tornado. And so don't think that didn't have an impact on the banking business, because pretty much shortly thereafter, some of the banks that were in the suburbs, relocated, and we still had a unit banking state. And I think that's an important thing to know.
Explain that. What do you mean?
Well, it's kind of an interesting process, and it was in place until 1987 in Texas. If you had a charter, you had to have one location. You had to have a separate charter, which big holding companies, InterFirst and others, had multiple charters for each branch. They had, or a separate charter for each branch, but they could not have but one location per charter. And so, my dad, I'm a little biased, I admit, but he was a little smarter than a lot of folks. He had devoted his life to banking, and so he had a building at the corner of 5th and Franklin that was the Citizens National Bank owned it at the time. He had a little drive-through at the corner of 5th and Franklin across the street, and then he had a parking garage that he needed to have enough parking for the facility at 514 Franklin. So today you see these overpasses that are over 5th Street, and that was required by law. And those buildings had to connect. They had to connect in some form to meet the unit banking code. And so
really
those overpasses weren't nice things to keep you out of the rain.
Right.
Although they were nice things to keep you out of the rain, but they were also necessary legally to meet the Texas banking code.
That is fascinating. Yeah.
Now you mentioned charters. That's a great question. There's national charters, right? State charters. What's the difference between a national bank, a state bank, a private bank?
It's this national charters are overseen by the Office of Comptroller Currency, and so the OCC would examine a national charter. A state charter gets examined by the state banking department and the FDIC, and each and every exam alternates. So Community Bank and Trust is a state charter. There are numerous national charters here in town. They have to have national something in their name to distinguish them, and they are examined by the OCC. We, as a state charter, are examined by the state, and then our next exam is FDIC, and then the next exam is the state.
Okay, as you're unraveling the mysteries here, one more, which we don't have any more of, seems like savings and loans. Where did those fit in? And credit unions. Where did those fit in?
That's a separate charter in amongst itself. The S&Ls are no longer really around anymore. They had a rough go in the 80s.
Yeah. We might get to some of that history in a bit. Yeah.
And we had some really good ones here in town, but they were kind of swept up in amongst just the industry failure. There are a few state savings banks, which are the remnants of that, and there are a few charters that still have the SSB is what it's called, State Savings Bank, and they still have that charter. And of course, credit unions. I'm gonna take the high road and because
hey, we're not here to cause any problems.
They are still another kind of silo of charters, and they were created to be real small institutions targeting really the employees of an organization.
Right.
Genco Credit Union, which is massive today, started out as General Tire Credit Union.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so the advantage that CUs or credit unions have is they don't pay federal income tax at all. And so that's a pretty good little advantage, but they have morphed a little bit. I'm not going to go too much further down that road because my bias may. But they compete handsomely against all banks and others, and yet they don't pay federal income tax.
I've been trying not to pay federal income tax for years.
Well, the tax code may have some little nuances in it that are to your advantage, but zero isn't one of them. So anyway,
I think back to this early period we're talking about when the federal government's not that involved in banking, and trust and confidence in your local bank was everything. And I think of this, there's this cycle in American history then of these panics where there would be panics in the financial system and there'd be runs on banks and banks would close and things like that.
You basically saw the Depression, 1929, and the few years after that through, 34, 35. And that's when the FDIC was begun. That's when Fed and all the different regulatory bodies and the oversight stepped up significantly. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But if you run your bank like, the people want you, your customers want you to run it, it's really the best. And so, you come in and get a bank exam, and that bank exam goes reasonably smoothly. There's always a little something to work on. But the bottom line is if it goes reasonably smoothly and you follow the rules and everything, that's and you do that voluntarily, that's really the best way. And the kind of the method that I support. But regulation is necessary.
But the challenge, I would think, for a local bank or even a state bank is you've got national competition now where you used to know your banker and have to know your banker. And
that's the basis of unit banking, to be quite honest with you. The big guys might open a branch or a charter in Dallas or Houston, They're pretty rare that they come to Waco in smaller cities than Waco even. And so consequently our number of charters in the United States when I started going was like, I don't know, 17,000 charters coast to coast. And today it's about 4,200 or so.
Wow.
Substantially smaller.
Yeah.
Smaller to the point of concern. And almost all those banks that have been gobbled up or merged or failed or whatever, a lot of them are smaller institutions and in smaller cities. There is kind of movement afoot, and I've rigorously volunteer in that regard at TBA and other areas to support the smaller city, smaller bank effort, because I think it's really important, especially when you're talking about small business loans, but most importantly in the agricultural loan world.
I could see just the general urbanization that we've seen. Less rural. I mean, even in Texas, west of I-35, the population's shrinking. So that just makes it harder and harder for businesses, including banks, to survive in all those small towns.
I would argue there's a little bit of competitive, evening the playing ground, so to speak, in the form of technology, but it's expensive for those smaller banks in those smaller cities. But they need it maybe even more than larger banks in slightly larger cities. They need that technology.
And tell me if I'm right here. It seems like there's been some strategy in going out and maybe getting some of those smaller bank charters for people who want to break into the industry and start a new bank. And so my example is just north of where I grew up in Plainview, Texas. There's a little town called Happy.
Yeah.
And there was Happy State Bank, and there's a group of investors that
they did
bought
well.
that little charter.
They also sold.
Happy State Bank is a growing enterprise in that side of the state.
And they were in most all the smaller cities and did a great job. They had their sign on the football scoreboard, and they did a good job.
Yeah.
And Pat Hickman is a good friend of mine, and I think the world of Happy. But they recently sold. And so the question is...
It's a great name for a bank, by the way.
Happy State Bank.
Yeah. But I've been in Happy. I don't think there's a Happy
It's
State
not that
Bank
really-
in Happy
it's
anymore.
not that great. Yeah.
And so the question becomes, like maybe 10 years from now, will the successor, I think they're out of Arkansas, I think. And so the question is, will the successor keep all those banks open in some of those smaller communities? And I hope they do.
Yeah.
But again, I keep coming back to my old quote, a bank and a community necessarily grow together. So we had the Depression, and the number of bank charters in Waco declined. And then, World War II was such a crazy thing, but it created a situation where the population of McLean County was a good bit lower because people were off at war. When the war ended, a lot of people came back, and then a lot of widows, needed financial services. So the trust departments in our city were integral, and the trust departments in these banks grew because they helped the surviving spouse handle their affairs, and they needed a little help, and we were glad to do so. So the trust department business in the city grew handsomely from 1946 till, 1960 or so. Then it got back on a more normalized growth rate, but it spiked up.
So describe that in a little more detail. What does a trust department do?
Well, the trust department can go two paths. One path is where the bank is trustee, and that's certainly for estate planning purposes an important thing. Back in 1946, there wasn't a whole lot of estate tax on the part of the federal government. Not so much anymore. So a lot of people form trust to move assets out of their estate, and so when they are no longer here, it can skip to a younger generation, and I think that's a good thing. But the other side of the trust department is where we are agent, And that's specifically what I'm talking about in 1946. We don't own those assets. We just have an account here. It's still in the estate of the widow or whatever, but we would sit there and counsel them and show them how to, keep their bills paid and what's a good investment look like, make sure that they didn't buy, long-term bonds when the rates were really low, or didn't, buy short-term bonds when rates were really high.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we assisted those customers, and there were a lot of them in McLennan County at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so 1946, the trust department services spiked up, and for good reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. With the S&L thing, with the savings and loan thing, getting into the ways in which regulations have changed to what a bank can do and what a bank can't do, and maybe how that's kind of shifted and changed over time.
Mercy.
Yeah. Big question.
One thing I want to respond to, you a few moments ago talked about some of these charters started with $100,000 or $150,000 or whatever the number was, and that was commonplace.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And it was so important because the capital was so small. Even inflation adjusted numbers, that's still small.
Mm-hmm.
Today, the Federal Reserve to de novo a new bank in a new city, and it doesn't matter if it's post Texas or if it's in Waco or Dallas or wherever, is about $25 million. And so, as you can see, those smaller cities have a real uphill struggle starting a new bank once the old one has sold.
Yeah.
And it's a very, very, very different day and time in the de novo world of starting a bank. I'm not necessarily sure that's a good thing, because I think that the citizens of a community can and should come together, and they don't necessarily have to have a business plan that calls for them being the next J.P. Morgan Chase. They just want to have a little place in the local community, and primarily to make agricultural and small business loans.
Right.
I mean, I think that's where it happens, and I'm a huge advocate of that. I think it would be a great thing for our state if, we're down to about 450 banks now in Texas, the whole state. And I think it would be a great thing if we got back to 1,000, because the different cities felt comfortable and also workable in starting a new bank. But it is very hard to do because of federal guidelines and federal rules.
Wow.
So when at the beginning, when we talked about there being 21 banks in Waco, does that feel right? Is that normal? Is that average? Is that above average?
Well, the question would be, what would it look like back in the unit banking days of 1986 or so?
Yeah.
Boy, it would be a lot less than that.
Yeah.
Because what you find is a bank, it's picked, and they're good banks. I want to be real clear about the size of the banks. I guess I could pick on, I don't want to get too far out of what I'm authorized to say here, but an L3, they don't really finance a $300 million hangar in Waco, Texas from a local bank, nor should they. And so I'm a big advocate of some of these larger banks because they have their role. They have things that they do very well. And so J.P. Morgan coming to town would probably not happen had they not bought Bank One, which had recently been United Bank, here in town. So then you go to Citizens National Bank, bank I'm familiar with, and today that's Bank America. And Bank America does some great things here locally, but talking to really super small, their definition of small business is, 50 million in sales or some such. My definition is a little south of that.
Yeah.
And so they don't have a huge impact in McLennan County because of their target markets. Their target markets are a lot big. Somebody finances SpaceX. I don't know who that is, but somebody finances SpaceX. And so we need those larger banks, and they do great work. When it comes to much smaller business loans and ag loans and other things like that, I will tell you that this particular community is as well banked as any in the state. You can argue Lubbock, you can argue Tyler, but the bottom line is we have a lot of good banks in McClellan County, owned and operated by folks in McClellan County, and I think that's the byproduct of that is a huge benefit to this county.
So what are the key words to say to your banker to get the best rate on a loan?
Well, that's good. To me, I'll be real honest with you. Some of the lowest rates and some of the best terms and that are that I have ever given are from people who never asked for it. They just deserve it. And so the world used to be everything went to a bank. I'm talking everything, cars and businesses and home loans and everything. It's really different today.
Yeah.
And the manufacturers themselves, Toyota Finance and Ford Motor Credit and all those, they finance cars primarily.
Yeah.
But some people like doing business with a bank, so we still make car loans, and we're happy to do so. Business loans, I would argue a local bank is your best bet to get a small business, even a startup financed. And we got wonderful local banks in town. We got a good many, and pick one and get to know bankers in that bank, and I think you'll be fine. Then there comes the mortgage world. Banks make mortgages, just like we always have and always will. But mortgage companies have been real active in that world for a long time. And what they do is they sell it into what is called a secondary market. So you end up with loans that are warehoused, is the term they use, for maybe a year. And then they're put together in these large tranches and large blocks of loans and sold onto the secondary market. And so anyway, now in 2007 or 2008, there are problems with doing that. And so you have to be careful. But the bottom line, or the country, I should say, has to be careful. But in each of these worlds, installment loans or business loans or mortgage loans, banks is where it started, and I think we're still pretty good at it. But the different type of loan has kind of bifurcated through the years and is no longer unique unto the bank. The one common denominator, though, is once you get a relationship at a bank, doesn't matter what bank you talk to, there are multiple good bankers in this city. But once you get a relationship, I think, and I'm biased, I think you're better off, because if something happens, I'm not sure what that something is. Spouse passes away, two-income household, somebody lays you off from work and whatever, you need a little help. A global pandemic comes along.
Yeah.
Anyway, to make a long story short, I think you're better off at a local bank. I can also document that by the PPP loans. People have now forgotten what those are. But we made our one bank, we made $46 million worth of loans in 2 weeks. And I don't ever want to do that again.
Yeah. Wow.
That was like building 2 or 3 Alico buildings for your old HVAC.
Well, that was a good month for you.
It was a good month, but it was crazy. People were emailing each other at 11 p.m. and I finally said, "Go to sleep, folks. We got to
Yeah.
because we thought that bucket was going to run out. But
Well, and
they all went to local banks, and a lot of the big banks just said, "Nah, I'm not going to do that."
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
wow.
to testify to your comments there, the local banks, from what I see in my involvement in the community, they're the ones that are involved with our schools, involved with the chamber. They're the ones helping fund economic development and special projects through the community. I would say it's not just a, they're certainly being intentional, but there's really I think a feeling that that's what they're supposed to do, that they need to do. And I mean, a lot of those are your friends, and a lot of times you're the guy who pulls them together and, hey, let's go take care of this thing.
There's a camaraderie there. Nothing better than competing against them and winning. But the bottom line is they're my friends, they're my neighbors. I see them around town, and they're all good bankers. I can say nothing but good things about the other banks in town and the other bankers that fill those banks, and they're good people. And I for one, encourage every citizen and every business and every homeowner in this county to just develop a relationship. It really won't take you long because, we're good at it.
Yeah.
And so talk to somebody, come in and have a cup of coffee and invest 30 minutes or an hour with somebody. You'd be surprised at how far that would go.
Well, I'd be interested to know, as far back as you can, you think of coaches and they have a coaching tree, right? Football coaches. And they can talk about, well, this head coach coached with that guy, that, whatever. There's a banking tree in Waco, right? And when you start asking questions of some of these executives, you find out they didn't all just start where they are. They worked over here for somebody else and then had this opportunity, that opportunity. So I don't know, is there maybe describe some of that banking tree and some of the people that have been connected to that tree over the years?
I think the best way to handle that and to respond to that is to Waco Tornado Relief. It was established on May the 11th of 1953. It raised several $1 million. I want to say it was it might have been $2.5 million, and it dispersed that money in 1953. I'm this in no disparaging way am I talking about West and their explosion, but there's still a few of those dollars that need to be expended.
Right.
And
if I remember right, it was that was housed here, and we're in the Alico building, and the first floor was First National Bank,
Howard Hamilton,
and this building was unaffected by the tornadoes, so they housed them. Kind of the emergency response team was here, everything like that, and I think some other banks, maybe even your bank.
My dad and Howard Hamilton were the two signers on those checks.
Yeah.
So 2 signatures approved expending $2.5 million in a matter of months.
Yeah.
Knowing that they had the knowledge, they're saying this person had no insurance and was devastated, and this person did have insurance, but it was short of what was needed. So we'll give that person a little bit of money, and we'll give the person with no insurance a little bit more. And there weren't federal rules necessarily. It's just 2 people and their subordinates who were plugged in.
Yeah.
And they knew where the money needed to go. And so that's a great example of local bankers doing a pretty good job of helping out.
And do I remember reading the kind of the camaraderie? Your dad's bank was just outside of downtown. A lot of the other ones were located here in the midst of that got creamed, and he let them come operate out of his building for some amount of time.
What happened was, and I'll make this really short because you could have a whole podcast about this. In Harry Province, I don't know where that is, but Harry Province has a documentary. I encourage people to look that up and listen to it because it is eye-opening. The tornado came through about 4 p.m. and it wreaked havoc and devastation. My dad, it was long before cell phones and all the phone lines were gone. So my mom had kids at their house, and it was about midnight when Dad finally got home. And then he slept a couple hours and went back, and it was awful. It was everything was awful. But anyway, the rest of the story is that they cordoned off a lot of this downtown area, and really the only bank, because it just had to, it was rubble. And the only bank at that time that was near but outside that devastated area was Community Bank. It had been open 1 year. We opened in May of '52.
What would be the address of that?
1800 Washington.
Oh, where you are now.
Right
Where it is
we
now.
are now.
Yeah.
And anyway, to make a long story short, they set up card tables in the lobbies, and we cashed everybody's check with absolutely no way to know if the check was good or not. And we did that for 2 weeks. So ultimately, we kind of got back up and running until the clearinghouse could settle all those checks, and they all settled in a day or two, 2 weeks later. And one of the great stories, which I always mention how great our city and our county is, there was literally no losses on those checks.
Wow.
None.
Wow.
Zero.
Yeah.
And that is really saying something as to the honesty, integrity of people. A little bit like the Jimmy Stewart movie where can you get by with 25 bucks instead of 50? And people did it in 1953, and it was all 4 banks. 3 were on a folding table.
And what 4 banks would those be at that time?
That was National City, First National, and Citizens National set up tables in our lobby. And then, and it was us. We were the 4th bank, and American was named Belmead State Bank at the time, and they were the 5th bank in town.
Gotcha.
And they luckily, and thank goodness for them, were able to conduct business at their location. It was Waco Drive. I don't remember the exact location. Might be kind of close to where City Hall is out there.
Okay. And yeah, so you're mentioning names of banks that Wacoans today don't see. So what happened to those banks?
Well, banks, I don't know whether it's 12 or 14 banks or whatever it was back right after the Civil War, and then it grew and it shrunk back and everything else. I would venture to guess there were more banks sold than there were failed, but there were a good bit of both.
Yeah.
And so what would have made a bank fail? Well, the Depression would be one. The cattle and cotton little era was a good time for some banks, but obviously those agricultural purposes don't have great years every year.
Yeah.
And the undercapitalized nature of the banking business back in those days lend itself to some bank failures. Not necessarily an industry-wide thing, but coast to coast. But you have a bad economy in Waco, you're going to get hit.
Probably look at where it rained and where it didn't rain.
That's
so
exactly
literally,
right. Yeah, that would
make a difference.
That would be it. Now, obviously, the tornado was one of those other times, and World War II, had impact. All these national events. I keep coming back to that quote. The banking industry and the local economy, they have a way of moving together. And you want to save some acorns for a rainy day and when times are good. But on the other hand, you have to invest in certain times to be able to move down the road. So the banks that I'll mention, Belmead State, Citizens National, National City, First National, and us. We're all here in the early 50s, and that's 70 years ago. Wow, that's a long time. And the ups and downs that we've all seen and we've all changed hands in some form or fashion. I guess we are the only one that's still exactly the same. But that book of business, almost 5, is still here.
Right.
It's either Bank of America or J.P.
Well,
Morgan. Or whatever.
so Belmead State Bank becomes American Bank. And then, so what happened to what happened to Citizens?
The Citizens went and sold to Republic Bank, and then Republic Bank sold to First Republic Bank, and First Republic Bank failed, and we became NCNB. And then after that, it was Nations Bank, and then after that, it was Bank of America. I worked for 6 different banks and never changed offices. And so it was an interesting time. My dad passed away right smack in the middle of all that. And one of the last things I remember him telling me is stick it out a little bit. He said, you'll learn a lot. And boy, did I. I learned a lot about banking in the 1980s in the state of Texas.
So then First National Bank, which was our oldest bank, as we let out with the podcast, what happened to it?
It became M Bank. It sold out to a company called M Bank Mercantile, and out of Dallas. And then, oh boy, you're stretching. They from there they became. M Bank sold, and they quote unquote failed as well in the 80s, and that became Bank One. And then after that, it's the First National Bank that we have in town today is actually the First National Bank of Mart that was purchased by Monty and some wonderful people,
Monty
Hulse, and they. Branched into Waco. So that was a separate First National. Back in those days, but they run a wonderful bank today.
And then what was the other bank you mentioned out of that 5?
Well, let's see. It was Texas National. Was National City.
Okay, what happened to them?
Texas National, and then Texas National sold to Compass, and Compass sold to BBVA out of Spain, and then BBVA has now been sold to PNC Bank, and so PNC finds itself in Waco, and that's an awfully big bank. And Cadence is a big bank too, that's here in town, and J.P. Morgan is obviously the biggest of all banks.
Right.
And so, and Wells Fargo is here, and that's a derivative of that First National. During the tornado, was part of the Wells Fargo bunch. And so, wow, we've had a lot of name changes through the years.
I know.
The sign companies did well.
Well, your memory is remarkable to remember all those changes.
I lived it.
Yeah. Well, since you were talking about the 80s, let's talk about the S&Ls in the 80s and just kind of your memories of that period and what happened to that sector. Yeah.
One of the most important things, I think, when you're a banker is discipline, and it's kind of hard to do. So, they have things like the CRA laws that are in play now, and the first thing they ask you when the examiners ask you when they walk in the door and start asking a question is, what is your trade territory? Well, that's, for Community Bank and Trust, it's McLennan County. We try to keep it simple. And we'll loan money, and every census tract in McLennan County, we got a loan in that census tract, and that's good. That's what we're supposed to do. But the bottom line is, when you get away from that, you start increasing exponentially your risk profile.
I see.
And so the S&Ls in our city, whether it was Pioneer or Waco Savings or, it was Pioneer, Waco's the First Federal, good institutions, very sound institutions, took local deposits, and for whatever reason, and it's not for me to cast stones, they loaned some money on some real estate projects outside McLennan County.
Well, that was the trend in that market. That's what they were all doing.
Yeah. And so real estate loans, it didn't matter if it was in El Paso or Texarkana, they were all struggling in the mid 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, that was the thing that precipitated that. And was oil a part of it? Well, yeah, oil was a part of it too.
Mm-hmm.
Oil was struggling in Midland. The First National Bank of Midland, huge bank, failed, and they were at that time just purchased by Republic Bank, and so I think they were having trouble when the merger was consummated. But the bottom line is, technically, it failed under Republic Bank's management, and that was part of what failed Republic Bank. Big bank.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, the 80s were no fun.
Mm-hmm.
I have said this 1,000 times, and I don't know if anybody really appreciates it, but it's what sinks into me. It's like walking in quicksand. You took a step, you did anything, and you got a little bit more in trouble. So, it was hard to grow at all. In fact, I think looking back on it, some of the best things we could have done maybe 3 to 5 years early is start shrinking the balance sheets of some of those banks, as opposed to getting aggressive like we were. And more of us would have made it. Frost Bank made it. Community Bank of Trust in Waco made it. American Banker Bill Meade made it. And several others who maybe had sold to other institutions or were in town. Extraco was basically in Temple at the time, but they made it and have done well. Anyway, the rest of the story is that some of the banks did not do well in the mid 80s, and it was that flu lingered for 5 or 7 years till the early 90s, when we kind of started coming back out of that rough stretch.
You mentioned that change in 87 it was of unit.
Yeah, that was a big deal.
So,
and that was necessitated by the NCNB acquisition of the First Republic failure.
Okay.
Because they had all these things, and one thing, the FDIC is not a lot of fun to negotiate with, save and except when they're in trouble.
Yeah.
And so they had NCNB got a really sweetheart deal, and that is now Bank of America. Is coast to coast at Bank of America, but they had a Texas charter, one Texas charter, and they put all those branches under that one charter, and that's when unit banking went away.
Yeah. So what other major, that's obviously a real important point in a shift in legislation. What are some other major ones you've seen in your time?
Well, and I am unashamedly not a Republican, and I am not a Democrat. I am a fiscal conservative, and the debt in our nation,
which is what you want to hear from your banker, by the way.
The debt in our nation concerns me greatly, and I worry about that. But that being said, Gramm-Leach-Bliley was in the mid to late 1990s. I think that's right. And then the Dodd-Frank Act was 2010. I'm pretty sure that I'm right. Gramm-Leach-Bliley, GLB is the acronym in my industry, and then Dodd-Frank. Both of those were horrible pieces of legislation for a small community bank. It was, and I think it's kind of, you can't argue that at this, looking back from 2024 where we stand today, looking back in the late 1990s, and then Dodd-Frank in 2010. Merrill Lynch is a standalone organization. They're now part of B of A. I could go on and on and on, but the securities business was separated by Glass-Steagall from the banking business, and I think that's a good thing. The Dodd-Frank Act, we got sold a bill of goods, and some of the smaller bankers were told that if you were $10 billion, that you wouldn't have any impact on Dodd-Frank. Well, that is not only wrong, it's really wrong. And so blessed are those folks who voted against Graham Leach Bliley and voted against Dodd-Frank. There are 20 people about in Congress that voted against them both. It was just over-regulation, and it still bleeds over today. And Chet Edwards was one of those 20. And anyway, I pride myself in getting involved in our industry's legislation and our legislative process. And I'm proud of Pete Sessions. He's done a good job. He's on House Financial Services Committee right now, which is a big deal. But Chet was very active, and Chet literally called me the day before the vote and said, I'm getting a lot of heat, to vote for Dodd-Frank, and why am I voting against it again? And so I explained, and I was right. On that day in 2010, I'm going to say we had 8,000 charters. It might have been a little bit higher than that. We have 4,200 now.
Wow.
And so it's and all of those charters that we lost were smaller banks in smaller cities.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to be fully compliant in a small bank right now.
Wow.
But anyway, the rest of the story is that the history of our banking in Waco, Texas is rich, and it's full, and it's really special. I mean, things like variety of industries. I'm not going to name names because it doesn't help the story any. But a lot of great industries were here because banks came together. Lake Waco was expanded because lots of banks came together, and the people that were running those banks. Our Madison Cooper Airport was created by the bankers in this city. You look back at Baylor Stadium. People now know it as Floyd Casey. That was a 1950 effort. It was led by the banks in Waco, Texas. Heart of Texas Coliseum was out in the sticks. I mean, it was pasture land around there when it was created, and it was built and created by the banks in our city. And got to remember, that was right on the heels of the tornado, man. I mean, we're talking. Yeah. They kind of got that tornado and dealt that hand dealt to them, and they just kept on going. I look back and I marvel at the backbone and the strength that our city had. They did some wonderful. The Waco Industrial Foundation was formed in about 1952, and in 1953 we had a tornado. Yeah, and that would set back a lot of cities, but we kept on going, and I give the banks a lot of credit for that. And I would also add all of them. Every bank had a role. Built the Hilton Hotel. We built that because the city bond issue created a convention center, but we had no hotel. And so we built the Hilton collectively and participated out that loan and had the Hilton, which still stands there today, and it's been remodeled multiple times, and it's not the same hotel as it was back then, but you have to have a hotel next to your convention center. You just do. Yeah. And so those kind of things, the banking community in our city has a rich history of helping on those things. And I'm proud to be a part of that, but I'm a part, a lot of other banks in town too. Yeah.
Well, we're sitting on the 21st floor of the Alico building, so it's probably hard to look out the window without seeing where some money from the bank.
Yeah. That guy owes me money. That guy owes me money.
I'll be real honest with you. The one that it's ancient history now, but it really was an endeavor of the folks that were in town. Was the Farrell Center.
Mm-hmm.
The Farrell Center was built. Very little bonded indebtedness. Baylor just didn't believe in it at the time. And
they've since changed their mind on that, right?
They kind of have. Oh, okay.
A little bit.
But anyway, the rest of the story is that building was built, I think, for $14 million, which sounds pretty reasonable.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
No, that's
in
great.
today's terms.
Yeah, one of my friends who's a banker here in town made the point. We were just joking, looking out the window, but he's like, "Yeah, I got to the point where I had to change churches because I just couldn't sit in the pew and see all the people that still owed me money that had told me they were going to pay but hadn't."
Well, that is one thing that is very true, and I guess the quick way to get out of the banking business is to talk too much. And
on a podcast, for instance, I'm just kidding.
That's
Totally
the reason
kidding.
I've not named names is because it's just it doesn't add anything to the process.
Mm-hmm.
But I would argue, I don't know of a bank in my history, and I've been doing it a while now. I don't know of a bank who has turned down working on or contributing to a worthwhile community process.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they get out of the gate and they kind of trip and fall, some of these projects, but the bottom line is none of them that were needed or necessary or whatever. Look at TSTC, look at MCC. If you look on the boards, you look on the foundation boards, you look on the contributors list of those institutions, it's it's filled with a bunch of banking support. And Baylor, oh my gosh, too much to even talk about.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the help that Baylor received from local banks through the years is immeasurable.
Yeah.
Hey, I know we're running short on time, but you mentioned the Alico building, which reminded me of the insurance companies. We don't have as many of them here anymore, but they seem, especially at the turn of the century, 1900s, there's a close relationship between banking and insurance. I think Texas Life,
On.
Yeah. So tell us, unpack that a little bit. What's the?
I'll try to unpack as best I can, but we had a number of insurance companies, American Amicable, here in the building we sit. American Income was started by Mr. Rappaport, I want to say right after the war. Farm Bureau was established here, and they were about to move, and some of the folks associated with banks in this city gave them that property, and on the condition that they stayed. They were about to move to Wichita Falls. Farm Bureau is a big one. American Income, American Amicable.
And it was some of the same families that owned the banks that started the insurance on the side. I guess just having those assets.
It
was a way to deploy assets was through the
Texas
insurance.
Life. I mean, I'm not an expert in this world, but Texas Life still goes by Texas Life, but they're owned by Metropolitan Insurance, and that's obviously a huge company. But the Mayfields had that particular company here in town, and contributed mightily to all kinds of projects all over the county. And so it's sad a little bit when some of those sell to, I'm not saying foreign, but out of town interests.
Yeah.
And you never quite get the participation that you would like. But then on the other hand, I want to kind of brag on an H-E-B and a Mars Candy and all those kind of things. They're owned way out of McClellan County, and they support mightily the different interests that go on. So they deserve some credit, I think. And, the Waco Industrial Foundation needs to go in search of companies that have that kind of track record and encourage them to do more in McClellan County, because the spinoff and the byproduct of that is considerable. And so, anyway.
David, I want to thank you for spending time with us today. And I will say, we talked about this service of your local banker. David served over 1,000 local boards. He's been president of more than 50 boards here in town, including the Waco Chamber and some others that were mentioned earlier. Texas Sports Hall of Fame, Waco Industrial Foundation. And so you've done a lot of, as our local banker, one of our local bankers, you've done a lot of service on local boards.
And I appreciate that. Yeah. But what I will tell you, I've still got a little work to do to keep up with Monty Hulse and Willard Still and Bill Nesbitt and others who have done a lot of work in their days. So
stalwarts of the community for sure.
It's good to have those kind of mentors ahead of you, and hopefully I've mentored a few that will follow me, because I think it's important. I think it's really important. So I've enjoyed the visit. I know I've enjoyed the view.
There's always the view to fall back on.
Yeah.
And I don't mean Rick. I mean the view out the window. Yeah.
You are sitting next to the professor of the year too, so you got that. You got that going for you. Well, thank you for your time. Man, I know there are so many other doors we could open to walk through with you and learn more about the history of Waco. And so don't be surprised if you get asked back.
Well, I'm happy to help in any way.
Yeah.
Thank you, David.
Thanks to you both.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn.
Thanks for listening to the Waco History Podcast. Like what you heard? Subscribe, rate, and review our show on iTunes so we can reach more listeners. You can find show notes and info on every episode at wacohistorypodcast.com, and more info on Waco's past at wacohistory.org. Our theme music, used with permission, is Cross the Brazos at Waco, performed by the late Billy Walker. For more info on Billy's music, go to billywalker.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. This has been a Rogue Media Network production. Are you a podcaster? Let's talk podcast hosting. Are you tired of your current podcast host? Need real support in a community that gets it? At Rogue Media Network, we offer top-tier podcast hosting services to help you thrive. From hosting and distribution to dedicated support, we've got you covered. Starting as low as $25 a month. Join our community of passionate podcasters today. Contact us at hello@roguemedianetwork.com.